Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. UNICEF has said that it will help children, those children, of course, who are at this point in time in poor households or in households that are unable to feed their children properly, vis-a-vis school-going children, et cetera, et cetera. This is happening for the first time in its 70-plus year history of the organization. That is, this has not obviously gone down well with the government itself. We have Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's come out and has said that UNICEF is playing politics. Nevertheless, and as we know, certainly around the world, the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities in pretty much every society. So the UK is not unique in this case. But nevertheless, there's also this huge factor that the UK is genuinely one of the richest nations in the world. So in a sense, isn't it embarrassing almost that the UK would be in a position where it's unable to take care of its own children within its own borders? What does that say about how it's handled the pandemic, how inequalities have played out on the ground, social policies, et cetera, et cetera? There's obviously a lot to discuss. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by Dr. Paul Spicker, who is an emeritus professor of public policy at Robert Gordon University. He's joining us today from Edinburgh. We're also joined from Bristol by Dr. David Gordon, who is the director of the Bristol Poverty Institute. He's also a professor of social justice at the University of Bristol. David and Paul, thank you both for your time today. Paul, let me start with you. What do you make of the fact that UNICEF has had to make this decision? As I said, we've already had UK officials come out and said that this is, playing politics with what's already happening on the ground. Is that what you feel as well?
Exaggerate the importance of this specific decision. It's for a relatively small project, I understand, in Southwark London. It's something which has been mooted at certain times in the past, and my understanding is that it's not a new announcement, but that UNICEF had made a decision to do this over the course of the summer. The much more fundamental underlying problem is that there are people in Britain who are going without food. There's a recent report by the Roundtree Foundation, which basically shows that something in the region of 2.5 million people in Britain are destitute. That is, that they do not have enough money for food, for heat, for light, for clothing, for toiletries, or for basic shelter. And that's, I'm afraid, been a product of changes in our benefit system. I can elaborate more about the benefit system if you wish to know about it, but we've seen a phenomenal increase in dependency on food banks for people to be able to manage.
Yeah. David, what thoughts on this? And I certainly don't mean to, of course, exaggerate the situation, as Paul there correctly contextualized it for us. But this is still concerning, isn't it? I mean, and as I said, Jacob Rees-Mogg coming out quite strongly against UNICEF's decision. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a huge embarrassment for the government and the country. I mean, for UNICEF has been helping children in every country in the world for 74 years. Britain is still one of the richest countries on the planet, and yet UNICEF now needs to help feed hungry children. This is a national disgrace. It should never happen. We have a comprehensive welfare state, or at least we did have, and we should be more than able to feed our own children in the United Kingdom. What has happened is, although the government has introduced policies which have boosted the incomes of people on benefits by increasing universal credit payments, they have also, for ideological reasons, poked holes in the welfare state. So although relative child poverty may be static or declining, the number of people sinking into deep poverty seems to be increasing dramatically. And this really has never happened in my lifetime before. Families with more than 2 children, families who are deemed to have too good accommodation are having the amount of money they get cut by the government. And in October, the government took the extraordinary decision not to continue with additional monies to help children who were not getting school meals during the school holidays, despite the fact that almost 1 million people signed a petition demanding the government do so. The government has now reversed that policy, but nevertheless, the holes that they are now in the welfare benefit system means that there are more and more children who are sinking into deeper and deeper poverty, and that has never happened before. And the government really needs to reverse these decisions.
Paul, what are your thoughts about what needs to happen? I mean, do you agree with David there that essentially it's the government now that needs to change its policies vis-a-vis children? I mean, children are obviously the first who should be, ensure. I mean, we must ensure that obviously children within our societies are well fed, especially those who are school going.
I very largely agree with what David has just said, with perhaps one exception, which is that I have seen this before, that in the early 1980s, the Policy Studies Institute was reporting that half the families on benefit were running out of food most weeks, and that was because they'd run out of money. If you have a system where food distribution rests almost entirely on the money coming in to your daily budget, and you've had to spend money on other things, we have to ask what gets skipped, and the answer, unfortunately, is probably food. Now, if we ask why has this been happening now, why is it happening again, it's been because of, I'm afraid, some very destructive changes in the welfare system. I can't list them all, but I would point to two particular things. The first is that there are some people now for whom there is no safety net, where there will be periods when they have no income at all. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Clearly, COVID is making it worse. We don't have all the figures yet in about COVID, but some things were built in to the reconstructed universal credit system which make this happen. And they include, for example, making people wait 5 weeks with no income before any benefit is payable. And they include amongst other things, sanctions where people have had benefits stopped for 1 month, for 6 months, and in some cases for even longer, for up to 3 years. And then there are also measures which have eroded the thresholds of income that people are permitted, that the government makes an assessment of need and then says, and for these reasons, we're not going to pay you. And that happens because of debt recovery. It happens because there are new rules saying that they're not going to pay for more than 2 children in a family. It happens because of limits on housing costs. It happens because of benefit caps. This is, I'm afraid, something which has very much undermined the principles on which the system was designed.
David, I would imagine to an extent that the government would argue that, listen, this has been a tough time. Obviously, they need to deal with the fact that Brexit's just literally around the corner and the effects of that, the economic effects of that, of course. And then secondly, the pandemic has certainly been something that has been unforeseen for every nation around the world. Within that context of both of those huge, huge realities, should we have expected a certain level of this, a certain percentage of this to have happened anyhow?
Well, UNICEF started this program in August. It's a £700,000 program that will run until February 2021. It's about $1 million US. So it's not that small. And there's more and more use of food banks. Despite Brexit, despite COVID, there can be no higher priority than ensuring that children are not going hungry. I mean, that's true for any nation in the world, and whatever your political views are. Why would anyone become a politician and not want to prevent children in their own country from having to go to bed hungry? So there can be no higher priority, really.
So if I may stick with you then, David, for one more question. What then does the government need to do now to reverse the situation? Or, I mean, are we almost in a situation where it's too late to fix this? Because, again, the government says that its record is, in fact, the opposite of what UNICEF is claiming, that it's, in fact, I believe the number is 100,000, if I'm not mistaken. I might be overstating that number, that it's brought out of poverty during its tenure. Those are very, opposite sort of realities that we're facing, aren't we?
The analyses of the government statistics by the government itself and by independent academics shows that child poverty, in particular deep child poverty, has got worse, that there are more and more children going hungry. These both academic surveys and government surveys, you can cherry pick one particular measure if you want. The claims the government has made are not true, basically. Poverty has been getting worse, not better, particularly amongst children.
All right, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. As a final point, what do you think will happen now going forward? I mean, this has been, I would hope and I would imagine, a wake-up call for the government, or do you think that the policies will continue as is because there's so much on its plate vis-a-vis both the pandemic and Brexit?
The government's shown its ability to throw very large amounts of money at certain problems, and a great reluctance to respond to other real problems, including children going hungry. But under pressure, they have often changed their mind. I wouldn't say that the changes which have been made so far are in any sense adequate to the problem. I think there's a great deal more that needs to be done. And I think we need to start thinking about our benefit system differently. In the government's mind, their big issue in benefits is to get people into work. Well, we've seen lots of people going into work and being poor, unable to manage, and using food banks while they're in work, because work is not a sufficient answer to the problems that they're dealing with. Effectively, what we've got to ask is for the government to start thinking about these things differently and to look at how it is that people can have a basic foundation of income. And an example of the way that that can be done is child benefit. Child benefit is a universal benefit. It's been allowed to erode. It has been limited in its scope. We can get money to children rapidly and easily if we use the mechanisms which currently exist.
We'll leave it there at that, but we appreciate both Paul and David for taking their time out of their respective busy schedules for us. Paul, they're speaking to us from Edinburgh, and David speaking to us from Bristol, both of them contextualizing the situation within the UK. And as Paul there said, of course, we don't want to overstate the situation, but at the same time, as David there said, and UNICEF and other experts have said and alluded to, certainly this is unprecedented. On the part of some experts, they would even call this embarrassing also for the richest nation, or one of the richest nations in the world, that is, the UK, to then need the UN to essentially come in and feed its children, its poor children. Why have things gotten this bad? Why isn't there more uproar about this? And I would think that there will be, to an extent as well, as there has been for a while now. We've even had, athletes in the UK speaking about child poverty and ensuring that children do get meals, school-going children, that is, do get meals to be able to then concentrate on their studies as they must. Will the government be able to deal with the situation within the other context that exists, as I put to our guest, Brexit and pandemic? Will this be a priority, as it should be, of course, for this government, as for any other government that may come in the future as well? I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, we're going to hone in on, in this segment, once again, the UK's migration policy vis-a-vis asylum seekers and others who are seeking safety from persecution, and, of course, a whole host of other reasons for why people may seek to migrate in the ways that they have to the UK. Now, obviously, we have Brexit just to be about finalized right around the corner. December 31st is the final deadline. And seemingly, before that deadline, the UK is trying to enact as many deportations as it can, as it's allowed to within the Dublin Regulation, which gives the UK power to transfer refugees and migrants back to EU countries in which they first essentially arrived and or landed or came ashore, either or. Now, this is, of course, designed so that people do not seek asylum in several countries in one go, but with the UK now leaving the EU altogether, it seems to be wanting to use this option ever more. And that, of course, has raised alarms on the part of many human rights experts, as well as migration, et cetera, experts and analysts also. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Reuven Ziegler, who is an associate professor of international refugee law at the University of Reading. He's joining us today from Oxford. Reuven, thank you very much for taking your time to join us here in Scope. What are your thoughts about this? I know that there are a number of flights, seemingly, that the Home Office has already planned right before the deadline.
Yeah. Thanks very much, and thanks very much for having me on the program. The UK has had a rather interesting, I think would be the understated way of putting it, way of handling its relations to EU asylum policies over the years. So the UK has never been fully part of the whole so-called asylum acquis, so the whole scope of EU regulations and directives, but it did implement some, and the one that it particularly liked implementing was the so-called Dublin Regulation, and that, as you correctly stated, suggests that the responsibility for assessing an asylum application generally, and I say generally because there are exceptions to that rule, fall on the first state within the European Union that an asylum seeker has entered. And that's usually captured by them being fingerprinted through a Eurodac database. Now, there are significant exceptions relating to unaccompanied minors, relating to the time frame in which such an application can be made, and indeed also relating to human rights consequences of returning somebody to another EU country. But all of this is premised on still being part of the Dublin regulations. Now, irrespective of what happens in Brussels and indeed London over the next few days, it's not on the cards at the moment that the so-called deal that will be reached between the UK and the European Union would include a retention of the UK's membership or subscription to the EU Dublin regulation scheme. And that suggests that from the 1st of January 2021, the UK will no longer have at its disposal this particular policy tool. And that probably, as you indicated, suggests the degree of urgency that the UK has suddenly found in trying to enact those deportation flights.
All right, so then what are the human rights issues here? What are the international law issues here? I would think that the UK, after the fact, or even before the fact, in fact, I mean, for it to be doing this at this time in this very hurried fashion, that probably means the due process is not being properly followed. Am I right to say that?
Well, I think that's part of the argument. So I think part of the claim, and I don't want to, the Home Office usually says we don't comment on individual cases, but the reality is I'm not involved at the moment in any individual case, so I don't want to say anything about one or more of the specific cases involved in these flights, but the reality is the UK has to undergo a specific process before it takes on a so-called Dublin transfer, before it decides to ask another EU member state to take somebody back, quote unquote, and before it then ends up doing it. And there is an expectation that the UK, in the process of questioning somebody of why they are in the UK now, would try to ascertain whether there are valid reasons under the Dublin regulations and under general European and international human rights commitments the UK has for that person not to be returned. So I've given one example of unaccompanied minors, which is explicit. There are generally issues around family reunion and the right to family life, which may be significantly affected. There are also issues with specific EU member states where returns are problematic. So the UK is actually, as a matter of policy, does not return people to Hungary, for instance, because of Hungary's approach to asylum seekers. The European Court of Justice for many years has effectively prevented returns to Greece because of conditions in camps and detention centers. So there is a process that has to be undertaken. And it's very clear that the UK is now keen to try and get as many Dublin returns as possible before the 31st of December. And there is absolutely a risk, although I'm not able to point to a specific case where that has happened, that the UK would hurry these processes.
Okay, so let's talk after the fact then. Let's talk post-Brexit then, if we can, for a moment. What are your thoughts about what may happen then regarding how the UK then treats asylum seekers, refugees? It doesn't obviously give one much confidence when we have, words like invasion, etc., that with all the negative connotations that word brings being used by certain people, of course not at the highest levels, but is significant enough people in the establishment. That's worrying, is it not? I mean, will there always be this very negative way of viewing migrants and asylum seekers, do you think?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the UK is the UK, there's a bit of a dual-faced approach. So, the one hand, the UK suggests and does actually have a fairly small but nonetheless important resettlement scheme. It had a scheme that resettled about 20,000 vulnerable Syrian refugees, and so people who quote unquote arrive in an orderly way and solicited, the UK would want to welcome, and those it doesn't want to welcome are those, as you describe, who are invading it through the channel between France and the UK, and there have been all sorts of talks flouted around about trying to create waves in the channel that would push people away, and indeed trying, as with the trade deal, trying to adopt all sorts of Australian-style policies. Australia is notoriously known for having tried to interdict people at sea. At the end of the day, the UK remains a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention and 1967 Protocol. It remains also a member of the Council of Europe, and as a result, a signatory to the European Convention of Human Rights. Under both of these instruments, it will retain international and European human rights law obligations not to return people to a place of danger and to assess asylum applications properly. And so the departure from the European Union, in a sense, brings the UK into the general scheme of what you would expect countries who are law-abiding or international law-abiding to do, which is to respect their international law obligations. Sadly, the UK current government has not shown a great propensity to do so, and with the Brexit negotiations has very explicitly flouted the idea that it might actually breach its international obligations only undertaken last year in respect of Northern Ireland. So I think there's a lot of work that will probably follow for human rights lawyers, for activists, and for journalists, I should say, to continue to probe the UK.
So, I mean, with this, right now, and the reality that we have right now on the ground within the UK vis-a-vis asylum seekers and migrants, do you think that it's more about the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, or now hopefully nearing the end of it with the news of the vaccine coming out, and of course Brexit with all the the anti-migrant rhetoric that had come with that? Of course, not all of it was based on an anti-migrant stance, but some of it at least was to certain people. Does that play into this? I mean, certainly those sorts of narratives feed into this, doesn't it?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there are two elements to this. So let me start with the second part of your question. So in the Brexit referendum debate, there's been a deliberate conflation of immigration from outside the European Union, which also includes asylum, and issues concerning the free movement of people within the European Union, which is part of the EU treaty arrangements. And so very notoriously and infamously, Nigel Farage, the leader then of UKIP and later the Brexit Party, had this poster of people lined up basically on the Serbian-Hungarian border and saying these are the people who are going to be coming into the UK, even though this pertained to the 2015 so-called refugee crisis in Europe and had nothing to do with issues specifically around Brexit. So there's certainly a degree of anti-migrant rhetoric. There's also some facts on the ground with things like deportation flights to Jamaica and the Windrush scandal which happened in the last few years. But there may also, the silver lining may be that with the UK leaving the European Union, the rhetoric around this may calm down as well a little bit, because there isn't that scarecrow anymore around to beat. I also think the pandemic, going back to your first part of your question, the pandemic is interesting because the pandemic, of course, as a result of the pandemic, there were virtually no refugees arriving in the UK for months upon months. There's been no resettlement to the UK for months upon months. So if any, 2020 was a very slow year in terms of arrivals. The refugees were the most harshly affected by travel and other restrictions imposed by the pandemic. And so, I think hopefully as we see the pandemic off next year, I think the classic debates around immigration may return.
All right, so as a final, before I let you go in just a minute, if you can, what happens next then, do you think? I mean, you've already spoken about what may happen post-pandemic, but with the narrative set in place as it is, there isn't much discussion about what migrants and asylum seekers even contribute, right, to UK society. There was talk, I read a while back, about how post-Brexit, in fact, the UK will need ever more people, in fact, to ensure that its economy is churning along and doing well. In that context, do you think that we might almost see a complete flip of this? I mean, probably not to that extent, but not a complete 180, but maybe to an extent we'll see an easing of the rhetoric on the part of the government too?
Yeah, I think that's possible. I mean, the government has been speaking about quote unquote global Britain and about attracting the best and the brightest. It's also generally having seen Europeans not wanting to come to the UK because of Brexit, has actually found itself having to recruit people for certain jobs, for agricultural jobs, for nursing and other jobs in other parts of the world. It has, to its credit, removed student numbers from the immigration numbers, as you were, the ways they're being calculated, so as not to portray a wrong image of the number of people arriving each year. So it is entirely possible that perhaps more quietly than forcefully, the government will actually change tack on these issues. I mean, time will tell also how the Brexit outcome will shape the economy more generally.
Indeed. Well, that, Reuven, but we sincerely, of course, appreciate your insight and putting that onto context for us. That was Reuven Ziegler speaking to us there from Oxford, Associate Professor of International Refugee Law at the University of Reading, discussing there the fact that the UK is speeding up deportations, or wants to at least speed up deportations right before the Brexit deadline, December 31st, at least for now. That is what's being discussed as the deadline. This all because of the Dublin Regulation, which gives the UK power to do so, to return people back to the original EU countries that they originally landed in or came ashore on, depending on how exactly and what means they used to enter the EU to seek safety from persecution and other, of course, such issues that people seek asylum for. Will the UK respect international human rights laws post-Brexit? Is it respecting them right now? Or is it flouting the rules? And what will happen vis-a-vis accountability and justice then for all those people who are seeking then safety from persecution and other such issues, as I said? I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment, we're going to discuss Donald Trump and those he's appointed and their views on coronavirus and the pandemic and how to have dealt with it overall. There is now talk of one appointee of Donald Trump who had spoken about, in fact, encouraging herd immunity, which is something I know that we've spoken of previously when it comes to a country like Sweden, for example, which the king now there has admitted did not, in fact, work, that was a failed policy in that country, at least. And there was talk by this Trump appointee, emails have come out and being leaked that he essentially said that younger people should in fact be exposed in some ways to the virus, and so that they can, develop herd immunity, and that would be a good thing overall. That certainly, I would imagine, should be concerning not just for health officials, but just overall anyhow for how Donald Trump, possibly himself, and certainly his appointees have viewed the virus and the pandemic and how to handle it overall. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Calvin Dark, who is a principal and co-founder of RC Communications. He's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Calvin, good morning, and thank you for joining us. What do you make of these emails? I mean, there seems to be this very major push for herd immunity in these emails by this appointee, again, for the sake of, keeping the economy churning.
Yes, and I don't think it's any surprise. One, because Dr. Atlas, one of the president's advisors up until over the last month, openly, endorsed this idea. But I think, as I was reflecting on this morning, I think what helps put this in context is if we think about, around the end of January, February, and especially in the beginning of March, not only did the White House, were they thinking about these ideas about herd immunity, from president on down through his aides were saying that this was a hoax. And what specifically they meant was Donald Trump was afraid that it was being overblown so that it could hamper the one strong argument he had for re-election, which was the economy. And so, as you know, he said in those tapes he was going to play it down. That's kind of what's behind this. So I think what happened was, instead of choosing the option that was based on the science and the medical experts who, like Dr. Fauci, who've been in there since the mid-'80s, Donald Trump went the path of, this is a hoax, this is all about me. We're going to go this route because otherwise the Democrats will ruin the economy and I won't get reelected.
Would it be an overstatement to say that then this sort of attitude has probably led to major delays in doing the right thing?
Oh, definitely. Donald Trump always talks about, the things that he did that saved lives. You got to remember, it was only until late summer, maybe early fall, that Donald Trump was finally saying wear a mask. We were reminded this past week that it was 6 months ago where Vice President Pence, in an op-ed, said that, we were on the way out. There wasn't a second wave. It was all overblown. So, I think that had they taken it seriously in the beginning, and had they not made it political, I can't predict, exactly how much better it would have been, but I think it's undoubtedly would have been a lot better.
And now we have, in fact, Calvin, and as I'm sure you're well aware, young people, in fact, are being quite drastically affected by the virus too, at least the newer mutations of virus that I just was reading about a child, I believe it is in the UK, a 10-year-old child who is in the ICU and is doing very badly with no underlying conditions, that is from before. Do you think that those realities will come back to haunt then the legacy of Donald Trump and the way he's handled this entire situation?
Yes, I think so. I think the more that we learn about the current, COVID-19, nobody would have been perfect. And there's going to be things that even the most well-intentioned, trusted in science somebody is, that, they're going to make mistakes. But I think that people are going to look back and, see that at the height of the second wave, Donald Trump was mocking his opponent in the election for wearing a mask. And he was mocking him for being in his basement because he was actually trying to socially distance. We always talk about these super spreader events that he had at the White House when he announced his nominee for the Supreme Court and other events, where people all around him got sick. At a speech in Tulsa where one of his biggest supporters, Herman Cain, died. That's the thing that somebody's going to look back at and say, what was going on?
Yeah, so then do you think that Joe Biden coming into office then will be a complete 180 on this sort of thing? Because, as I said, it's not like it was only the U.S. that discussed herd immunity. It was also discussed in Sweden. And now, of course, the king there has come out and said that was a failed policy. But nevertheless, it's not like this was a completely, out of the blue crazy idea. Am I right to say that?
Well, I think if it had not been politicized, it would have been something where I think there could have been a legitimate discussion around, but that it wasn't based on science. And another aspect of the political dimension of this argument is, like you mentioned in Sweden, and there are other places around the world that try different things. Instead of looking at those scientifically and saying, how does that work? Would that work if you tried it in the United States? It was purely political, that if the Democrats say it doesn't work, they're just trying to ruin the economy. So I think that, for example, one of the things that President Trump brings up a lot is in the very beginning, there were some health officials who were saying, not to wear a mask. And, some of them were saying it because they didn't want the mask supply to get taken up. And so, I think most people and most Americans understand that this is a new virus and that there will be mistakes made. But I think the difference is where the motivation's coming from as to why certain strategies were taken.
And Calvin, the worldwide argument on the part of many governments was that, listen, we can't have a solution or preventative measures that are worse than the virus itself, i.e., having economies completely shut down. We need to have the economies churning so that people are making enough money to be able to feed themselves and their loved ones as well, because they can't completely depend on their respective states. What do you make of those sorts of arguments in the context of the U.S. as well?
Well, I think that what you have to consider when you think about those arguments is that the same people in this country who were and are right now making the argument that you can't shut down the economy because it'll ruin our economy. You can't shut down because of the virus. Those are the same people who weren't following the rules during the partial shutdown that we had and were protesting it then and then saying it didn't work. And we also have to realize that there is a mentality on behalf of many in this country, particularly on the right, that a good economy trumps, no pun intended, better health for our nation. And the specific example I think about is the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, who said during the partial shutdown early in the pandemic that if older people were given a choice of saving their lives or ruining the economy for their grandchildren, they would die, which I don't think doesn't reflect my thinking, but I think it does show that that's how some people approach this, that economy trumped all.
All right. As a final word, then, before I let you go, Calvin, this morning, we're now in seemingly the phase where the vaccines will be coming in, but we have numbers going up quite drastically in the U.S., right? And I believe I was just watching an interview with Dr. Fauci earlier this morning at Lahore time, and he was talking about very high numbers and the situation not being, positive, at least for the next while. What do you think Donald Trump's plan will be now for the remainder of time that he's in office? I mean, it's just a number of weeks now, but nevertheless, he can still have a significant impact on how all of this is carried forward, right?
He could. There are some things that he could do. I'll tell you, and this shows you how optimistic and maybe unrealistic I am. As you've been hearing about Vice President Pence is going to get the vaccination, Joe Biden's going to get it next week. I thought about in an ideal world, you would have the outgoing president and vice president on a stage with the incoming president and the incoming vice president all taking the vaccination. Of course, even saying that sounds insane because they were not even talking to each other. So there is a lot Donald Trump could do, but he won't. He has not done anything up to this point. He is focused on, his efforts at overturning the election, which is unfortunate because the American people will suffer in this interim.
All right, Calvin, it was a pleasure. We appreciate your insight and speaking to us this morning from Washington, D.C., discussing how a Trump appointee had spoken of herd immunity in emails. Again, not a completely crazy idea, as Calvin also there alluded to. It may very well have been something that could have been discussed at some level had it not been a completely politicized issue where Donald Trump just came out from the get-go and said this isn't a hoax, and seemingly a lot like Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil. Had these leaders been a bit calmer in how they had reacted to the virus, maybe all of the above theories could have been discussed in some more reasonable fashion, in a more scientific way, where they would need to be disproven or proven. And of course, the discussions about balancing the economy, that's also certainly an important discussion. That's an important discussion that every nation has had to have to be able to balance how they respond to this very important health crisis, as well as, of course, to keep their economies churning as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.